Okay, John. Let's go back to the earliest days of you remembering farming. So can you describe, well, first of all, I heard before, and tell us where you were born.
I was born in Savage in 1940.
And you were living where at that time?
We were living in Savage and later moved to Laurel.
So in Savage, was that a farm?
No, that was just a little community.
And then tell us, as much as you can remember, because you were obviously a little one, how you remember getting to that farm, or what you know, from now looking back. What were the circumstances that made you leave from Savage and head on out to that farm?
Okay, and probably around 1944, my father bought a piece of property which included the old Ely Oak Schoolhouse, which was then on Route 29, and today that would be Route 108 at Ely Oak. And my father, before he went into service, he remodeled the old schoolhouse to make it livable. And the Gardner farm surrounded our place, so there was always farming going on just right to the fence at the property line. And I remember two things around 1944, 45. One was when my mother got a telegram that my father had been injured during the war. And also there were German prisoners of war working in the fields right next to our home.
You got a question about those prisoners?
Were there prisoners also on that farm, John?
The prisoners were on the farm, at the Gardner farm, because all the men were fighting or off at the war. And so they had the prisoners of war. I think they were housed over off Folly Quarter Road, but they would bring them in each day and they would work the fields.
When you said they were housed, did they go pick them up every day, or in fact did they stay for a period?
They were picked up every day. And some might have been housed actually at Fort Meade, being it was close by.
You have an idea where they were picked up, that particular group?
No, I don't, no.
Okay.
Like I say, I was only 5 years old, but I do remember them.
Probably was at the freezer locker at St. John's Land. That's where I remember mostly.
Who all were running that farm then, that you can remember?
The neighbor's farm next door, like I say, it was Mr. William Gardner and his son Jimmy Gardner ran the farm. It was a small dairy farm, but they did their own baling hay, and pretty much the two of them ran the whole farm. But there were times as I grew older that I just couldn't wait to get out there and help bale hay.
So you could see from your bedroom window, for instance, the farm operation, or how did you get to observe the farm operation?
Well, like their farm surrounded our 2 acres that we had at the time. And like I say, when they would come out into the fields, it was always fun just to go out in the field. It was just across the fence. So I would also go to the milking parlor in the evening and watch them do the milking.
Do you remember what kind of farm machinery they had? Did they use old antique archaic stuff, or they had modern equipment?
They had a fairly up-to-date John Deere and a modern baler at that time.
Did they have any kind of wheat or anything like that that they thrashed?
They did have a field of barley that was back behind the house. And I remember Mr. Ed Bassler. He didn't have any sons. He had at least 2 or 3 daughters, and those gals would ride the combine. Back then, you had to ride on the combine, and it was like a 2-bagger. There again, it was a full, pretty hefty job for a couple of the young ladies in those days, and it was the dirtiest crop.
Can you hear that airplane? If you don't, we just proceed.
Let's hang on for a minute.
Hear that thing? Hear that airplane out there?
Oh, yeah.
Somebody's gonna jump out, I think.
On my way. You doing this weekend?
How you been?
Yeah, I'm on a safety seminar.
Oh, cool. I guess you know about his jumping.
Oh, yeah.
lifestyle.
Yeah, his brother was in my class, and that's all I could hear about all those years, was how many jumps they had made.
Wow. Let me put this up. I want to put this up a little higher. Put this just a no, you're fine. Just hang on. Thanks. Okay, so here we are, this little guy John, and he's now beginning to observe farm life out the next door neighbor farm. Who owned that farm again?
Mr. William Gardner, and his son Jimmy is still alive. He would be a good one to interview too, because it was a family-run operation. But I also had an Uncle George Haker down on the old Montgomery Road, but he was still farming with horses. So they had the old sickle bar that was drawn behind the horse, and then they had a hay rake, and then everything was loose hay, as we would call it, that would pile up on the wagon and take to the barn and put in the loft.
Did you ever witness them taking the hay into the loft?
Right, they would pull the wagon alongside the end of the barn, and the fork would come out on a track and drop down and get around a bunch of hay, and then it would pull back up the track and then go inside and dump it. A horse would be doing this operation, pulling the rope for the hay.
So you remember even the horse pulling the rope?
Yes, yes,
Because later on they used tractors.
correct.
So, any inspiration starting to happen between you, the youngster, and wanting to be a helper on the farm?
My father, one year for Christmas, gave me a Washington Post newspaper wagon, and it was probably twice the size of a radio flyer. It would hold 4 or 5 gallon cans at that time that we'd put feed in. So probably when I was 9 or 10 years old, I would, in the summer, I would go up to the Curtis's turkey farm and help with the feeding of the turkeys. Like say, we would put 4 buckets in my wagon. I would take them out in the feed lot, put the feed in the troughs, and of course the turkeys would eat that. And back then, there were no 50-pound bags. All the feed came in 100-pound bags, which was quite a chore, probably only weighing maybe 45 pounds myself.
Now, was this a non-paying or paying job?
It was non-paying, but in the long run, Mr. and Mrs. Curtis would take me to the Montgomery County Fair on Wednesday nights when they would have fireworks. And Mr. Curtis and I built a barbecue out of field stone there in the backyard. And I remember very well the first cookout that I ever had on a outside grill. The best steaks that still I can remember.
So, did your dad ever get involved in farming?
Well, my father actually grew up on a farm off of Cedar Lane down in Simpsonville. Their family farm was
Before you were born?
before I was born.
Can you tell me about that family farm?
The family farm, was, like I say, was down at Simpsonville, way back off the road. But he and his 2 or 3 brothers lived there on the farm and did all the chores and all that back in the day. And as a young man, he also worked for Mr. William Kaler.
And what equipment do you remember them using?
Well, when I worked with the Curtises, once they got to 1955, they bought a brand new John Deere tractor. And they had no fear of putting me on that tractor or letting me use it around the neighborhood to cut hay. And just like say, then we could put the feed bags right on the lift of the tractor and take them out into the field for the feed.
Do you remember what farm father used?
My father had, at first, because we had over an acre of garden, he had a little two-wheel tractor that was not much more than probably 5 horsepower. It had a single plow and he would work the ground up, and then always had a large garden at home. And then around 47, he bought an economy tractor, which you could sit on and also do the plowing, and had a disc, a drag, cultivators. So he really moved up when we got the economy tractor.
What's the farthest back you can remember your dad ever talking about in your family history, your genealogy? Great-great-grandfathers or great-great-grandmothers or anything?
Well, on the Goodman side, his father had passed away at an early age. And
how old would that have been?
probably in his 40s, 45 maybe. Most of the Goodman side was from Amelia, Virginia. They had migrated up toward Maryland. Like I say, I think there was over 100 acres there that they farmed. But back then, like I say, they used mules and horses. So my father always said, if a mule stood on your foot, the harder you tried to get him off, the harder he would stand on your foot.
And this would have been your great-grandparents or your great-great-grandparents?
That would have been the grandparents.
Grandparents?
Yes.
You remember any further back than that?
No.
Remember your dad talking about his father?
No, not really. Like I say, he died at a young age, and then I guess they were probably late teenagers when the farm was sold. Then all the 4 brothers all went into World War II. They were all gone at the same time. It's hard to imagine, say what my grandmother went through, knowing that her sons were in different parts of the world during World War II. The worry that she probably had.
Now, did you personally or your family ever remember not having electricity or not having water?
When we first moved out to Ely Oak, my father did put in a bathroom that was inside, but when we went to visit relatives, they were still having outside outhouses. So it was common back then. But once you got used to going inside, you didn't want to go outside.
When you say back then, you mean like 1930s or?
Oh, this would have been like 45, 46. Yeah, I had relatives that still had outhouses at that time.
So here you were, John, helping with the turkeys. Was this a daily thing for a while, or?
During the summer, it was a daily thing.
Tell me what a typical day was like at that time for you working with the turkeys.
Well, it wasn't a thing where I had to be there at a certain time. I would just pull the wagon up the road, and when it was time to feed, we would take the feed out into the lots, because they raised around 3,000 or 4,000 turkeys. So it was quite a lot. And they were what you would call open range. And like I say, at lunchtime, I would go home and have a sandwich. And when I went back after noon, the Curtises and I would sit out underneath the maple tree and kind of tell stories and just have fun for a little while. They used me to clean the turkey cages. Now, when you first get the peeps, they're very small, but as they grow, you had to put them in larger cages. So they would put me in one of the cages with Lysol, and you had to scrub them down to get them sterile again. So, and then when it came time, as they grew, they would do the vaccination, the debeaking, and clip the wing to keep them from flying.
Do you remember any other turkey farms besides the Curtis farm, or was it competition?
There were 2 other farms, Mr. Smith down on Montgomery Road and Mr. Ellsworth Yeager over at Fulton. Both had turkey farms, large operations.
They were larger than yours?
They were large, very large, yes.
So all these turkeys came in to feed. Were you actually in there with them, or you got out in time? Because all of a sudden they got 3,000 turkeys showing up and saying, "We're hungry."
Yeah, oh, you were always in with the turkeys. And the Curtises had 2 German Shepherds that kind of self-trained that herded those turkeys. Now, it was funny, if one of the turkeys would get out of line, the shepherd was trained just to grab a hold of a wing or a leg, bring it back into the herd, and put them on the next lot. Because within a few days, they would pick a lot clean.
What ages were you then? What age was that for you when you were there?
Around 9, 10 years old.
Did any turkeys come after you? Did any turkeys come after you?
Oh, no. The old-time turkeys would all fluff all up and strut around, but they didn't seem to bother you. We had an old-time at the house because we would raise a couple ourselves. And I guess he really got ornery, and he would chase you around the yard. And I remember the morning we went out, and he had not made it through the night, which was a relief.
The end of Tom, huh?
I think old age got him.
As far as the environment goes, were the turkeys destroy the land, or did they contribute to the fertilizing of it?
Well, they surely helped fertilize, but the Curtises had a deal with a fellow from Anne Arundel County who did gardening, a large scale, and they would come up and when it would dry out and scrape off the top 3 or 4 inches of the ground and take and put it on their gardens.
How long did the John and his turkey farming helper job go?
Well, it went actually on into high school because, like I say, with that many turkeys, when it came time for the vaccinating and the clipping, they would get 2 or 3 other neighbor boys and my grandfather and I all in the turkey house, and we had a setup where someone would catch them, then they would pass them on for vaccination, then debeak, and then do the clip of the wing. So there were 4 or 5 other fellows. Like say, I was on into high school when we'd go up and help on those special days.
Without getting too detailed, you were observing this kind of maintenance of the turkeys as well, or did you participate?
Oh, we participated, yeah. It was like an assembly line, and everyone, the kids would come around like some from other neighbors, and everyone knew their job, and we would do 1,000 turkeys at a time.
This is sounding odd, but how did you keep track of who was inoculated and who wasn't? Is there a system that you saw them using?
Yes, we had a, like I say, regular assembly line. Like say the person would catch the turkey, the young turkey, spread the wing, and then vaccinate, and pass it on to the next person, and they would hold the head down to this little machine that would actually burn the top of the beak off to keep them from picking each other. And then as it passed on, they would clip right in the corner of the wing. Therefore, the turkey could only fly in a circle.
Now, when the turkeys matured, what was their demise?
Thanksgiving.
Strictly Thanksgiving?
Thanksgiving and Christmas time. It was a large operation there they did their own killing, picking. So we'd go up, and I remember Mrs. Curtis. It was not a very tall lady, but she would go in with the hook, and she would come out of that pen with 4 tom turkeys, 2 in each hand, just flopping and carrying on. And but she handled it. She knew how to do that.
And you didn't get involved in any of that process?
Oh yes, I was involved there too.
Tell me some of the specific things you did.
Well, mainly it was helping to catch the turkeys, and there again they had an assembly line after they were hung up and bled out. Then they would scald the turkeys, and then they finally got a electric picker that would pick the feathers. But after that, you would still have to pick the what they call the pin feathers, the ones on the wings. They were pretty hefty feathers, and you really had to pull on those. And then they would put them in cooling tanks in cold water and it was usually cold then anyway, to help just keep them fresh.
Describe this electric picker, how it worked.
It was a machine that had a flat surface, but there were slots in it, and these, when you would turn it on, these rubber fingers on a wheel would just keep turning, and they would just automatically just pull those feathers right off. It was pretty amazing and quick.
You didn't boil the water like they did mostly for chickens, so the feathers would pull out real easily?
Right. They were, like say, they were, after they were hung out, then they would take and dip them into boiling hot water and scald them, and then that would loosen the feathers. Now, it came to be that Mr. Howard Curtis passed away in the early 60s, and I had gotten married and would still help there, but the turkey operation was when he passed away. And Mrs. Curtis would always have Thanksgiving dinner with us. My father taught her to drive. She never knew how to drive. And she came to me one day and said, pick out a lot, and I'll back you, help you build your house. And you know, it's one of those things you never forget. I mean, she actually gave me a start. For a person 22, 23 years old to have his own home was probably unheard of in those days. But my father being a carpenter, he and I pretty much built the house.
Did you have brothers or sisters?
I had 3 sisters and a brother.
Did they get involved in farming?
Well, my sister Barbara was a year older, and we were both in 4-H. And she went to a hog judging contest, a 4-H event, and she came home with 2 pigs that had been bred. So within a few months, we had 14 little ones running around. So, I mean, they were just almost like pets, but we sure did have to put the, what they call the hog wire around the whole property to keep them in. And to also put the rings in their nose to keep them from rooting. And one day, the mama pig, when she stood up, she stood on the shoulder of one of the little ones, and it tore the skin totally down off of the shoulder. So my father told my mother to get the needle and thread, and I had to hold the little pig, and I just pinched the gap together with my hands, and my father sewed the little pig up, put a little turpentine on it, and never slowed him up. And the same with the turkey. When we were raising turkeys, one of the turkeys broke his leg right at the joint, and so my father amputated the leg and wrapped him in tar tape, and he came to full life. Never missed a day.
So now we've got from turkeys to pigs because of your sister,
Yes.
and then you got involved in that process for a while.
Well, those were the mid-50s. I had started with lambs as a 4-H project, and then moved on up to steers, which I loved. Senator Clark was my neighbor. He had a registered Angus herd, so each spring we would go over to his place and pick out an Angus for my sister and myself. So, but my father always tended to have maybe heifers just to feed out at the home, and we would go out after the state would mow along 108 or 29 back then, and wait a couple of days. We'd go out with his truck up and down 108 and pick up the loose hay and take it back to the house and make a haystack, so we had pretty much free hay.
What equipment were you using then to do this?
Oh, that was just a pitchfork and a truck.
Can you relate any other anecdotes about Senator Jim Clark that you can remember?
Oh, yes. Him being my neighbor, he was also our 4-H leader, so we knew each other pretty well. And there were times when maybe his helper was ill, and he would call me to come over and help with the milking. He had the pile away probably almost a mile off the road. But anyway, it was in the neighborhood, so I would go over and help him do that. And when I was doing the 4-H steers, he and I made a deal. The pickers back then were not all that efficient, and they dropped a lot of ears of corn. So Mr. Clark and I had the deal that I would pick up all the corn that was dropped and split it with him 50-50. But then he would grind my corn for me for the feed my steer. So it was helping hand, it always worked out.
So, when you were young and you were doing the turkey work, what did you do in terms of like your Sundays?
All Sundays was always, Sunday school in the morning, and then stay for church, and then seems like every Sunday was fried chicken. And sometimes we would go to the other cousins that lived in the county, and especially down to my Uncle George Haker's. 1 or 2 times a year he would do a crab feast, and there would probably be 20, 30 people there, just old friends and relatives.
Did you at some point think about having your own farm?
Well, probably when I was 14 or 15, my father, I guess, thought it was time for me to get a real job that might pay something. So he would get up probably 5:30 in the mornings for his job to go into DC or PG County, and he would put my bicycle in the back of the truck, and we would go down Cedar Lane, and he would drop me off at the Kaler farm. So back then that was still all dirt roads. So he would drop me off on the bike, and I would ride back to the main house, which was probably close to at least a half mile off the main road. And I would help the Kalers first thing in the morning. My main job was feeding the pigs and the geese. So Mr. Kaler would go each day into Baltimore to the bakeries, and he would come back out of town with a full truckload of one-day-old bread and buns. So I had to do the sorting out. You mix the old bread with water, and then you slop the hogs, as it's called, and the geese or the ducks. And you would always pull a pack of your favorite buns or donuts out to take to the field with you. Now, another thing I had to do in the morning, the first thing, was water the bull. Now, the bull is pretty dangerous, especially one-on-one. He was on a stake in the middle of the field, which is where his water bucket was, or the big barrel. And each morning I had to take a 5-gallon bucket of water or 2 into the pen with the bull. So we always made eye contact, and I would slowly move toward the water can and dump my water and then back out. And he never took his eyes off of me. But believe me, if he'd have made one move, I'd have been gone, coming or going with the water. But it was always an interesting way to start the day when you had to water the bull.
Any other possible or potential or actual injuries in your farming life down in those days?
No, I guess we had grown up around equipment, and you knew what to do and what not to do, but there was always a chance of an accident. There again, I rode the old tractor-pulled combine, and there again it was a 2-bagger, and we would go to the fields, and of course I would take those buns with me, and I'll never forget, there were 2 or 3 times on a hot day when the old machine would break down, and the operator of the tractor would have to go to the farmhouse where we were cutting and call Mr. Kaler to, come fix the combine. So we would just crawl up underneath of it in the straw and maybe take a nap and wait for him to get there. I need to wipe it.
Sure. That's good.
How are we going to find out that?
Oh, okay.
But
Go ahead.
any time you get a group of probably 4 to 6 men or boys involved with equipment that had wheels and motors, there was always a contest involved. And that would be like in the field, picking the hay up, the bales, stacking on the truck or trailer, pulled by a tractor, whichever one. And one team would try to beat the other as far as having 7 or 8 high that would stay on the truck or trailer till it got to the barn. But there seemed to always be that race when guys were involved, who would get there first, which made the day a lot more fun.
How did you do with that?
I loved it. They put me in an old flatbed truck one day. It was probably like a 9-ton flatbed, and we had gotten to a steep hill. And the 2 guys stacking, another throwing up the bales of hay. And as I started down the hill, the truck just took off. It jumped out of gear and away we went. And of course the guys on the back were screaming and the hay was falling off. I had no idea what happened. I was on the brakes trying to keep from going into the woods. But that made it exciting. As long as I can remember, I always had a garden and still do today. They're just the fresh vegetables and especially the tomatoes around here. I just love that. I can't do without them. So it was just one of those things. I remember back then the corn would have these extra shoots they called suckers, and you would have to go into the field and pull all those suckers off of the main stalk to keep them from depriving the main stalk of their nutrient. But as far as, I think I could almost go any time to help a farmer, a neighbor, to pick up hay and straw. In later years, friends of mine had a horse farm, and we were always having to get hay in and stack it in the barn. It was always the hottest part of the year and probably the most humid too. But it still seemed like it was fun to do, even up to maybe 6 or 8 years ago. I still did that.
Great. Can you compare your early farm experiences and farm life to today's farming?
Yes. Back then, the farmers around us maybe had 2 tractors at the most. Didn't seem to matter what the size of the farm was. And if not everyone may not have had a baler, but there was always what they would do, custom farming, to go help out a neighbor that would bale and take a crew with them to get the hay in. And back then, some of the farms used a wire tie baler, and those bales probably weighed close to 100 pounds, and the wires would almost seem like they would cut your fingers off. You really needed gloves. But compared to today's equipment, there's a machine that works the fields up near where I am in Upper Harrod County that's probably over $500,000. And he can go into a field and not leave a track of where he's been. So there's no ground impact like it was in the early days. But I can remember when they first started the contour plowing around and also using the multiflora hedgerows to divide off the fields. That stuff really got a good start, and it was really hard to deal with once it got a hold.
Good, John. Did you at any point in time figure out or relate to other, when this is back in the turkey days, did you have friends that were also like you in the sense of being involved with the turkeys, or other farming experiences where you could swap stories, with each other? Did you have fellow mates that you related to?
Well, in high school, like I say, when I was in 4-H and had steers, they're animals you had to tend to every day and work with them because you have to show them. So I guess when a lot of the guys who lived maybe like Elk Ridge or Ellicott City, they didn't have the responsibility of tending animals every evening or morning. So they would be, on football teams or basketball, And it seemed like, we just automatically just went home and tended our, like the things that we had. But there were farm boys like Phil Jones. He was in my class at Howard High, and Art and a few others that actually grew up on large farms. But we would always meet at the Howard County Fairgrounds for the 4-H club events. And at one time, Howard County, I think we probably had 50 to 80 steers in the county at that time, just by 4-H'ers.
Do you remember Brendel Manor Park, John?
I do remember Brendel Manor.
What do you remember of it?
Well, my father and mother were friends of the Brendels, and my mother had gone to school with Mrs. Brendel, and they would take us on Saturday night over to the park, and there was always live music, and they had a elevated dance floor, and there was a fellow called Happy Johnny, and he would be on the radios in Sunday mornings, and he loved to whistle, and I think probably that's where I learned to whistle or carry a tune.
Those were singing days or they were whistling days?
I was a whistler.
Live entertainment.
It was live entertainment, and
I mean, did you perform?
oh no, not until we got into probably junior high. The Kiwanis Club of Ellicott City started a little band, and had a teacher come in on Friday nights and taught us how to play the instruments. If you didn't have one, they would rent you one with option to buy. But it was a great time. We got to play at the different carnivals. We played on the boat to Tallchester back in Ellicott City days, when the whole town would close up and go to Tallchester for a day. We were on Channel 2, probably back in the mid to late 50s. The whole band went downtown and we did live music.
So you played a instrument or multiple instruments?
I played the bass clarinet and the clarinet, and I had a younger sister that played the piano, and we both played by ear, so anything we heard on the radio we could pick up and play, and pretty much still that way today.
You still playing?
And now and then I'll pick it up and play till I get tired.
How you doing? Questions? You good? I'm good. Anything else you can remember from those days that you think was important?
Well, I did end up with that John Deere tractor that my neighbors bought new in '55. And when Mrs. Curtis left the farm, I said to her, be sure a collector gets that tractor or a member of the family. She says, oh, I am. I'm giving it to you. So that was probably one of the greatest gifts I've ever had. That and her backing me when I built my first house. I was pretty much like a son to them, and enjoyed all those times we had. Even though it was work, I guess that's it's not a downfall, but I do enjoy building things and just working. I do enjoy working.
How do you feel generally about how farming is today versus what it used to be like?
You can answer.
It is really big time today. I mentioned before when medium to large size farm maybe only had 2 tractors back in those days, and now they have multi-units that just do everything, radio or satellite control. We had none of that. We just had to find the field and get in there and plow her up. There again, when the Curtises bought that new John Deere, it had a 2-plow hitch, and they would let us use it to plow neighbors' fields, and we would plant corn, and then we would cut each stalk by hand in those days and shock it up and wait for it to dry out, and then in the fall go to the field and husk it out. You had to use a husking pin to dislodge the ear from the husk, and then we would put them in big piles, and then after a couple days, go back and load it all up on the trailers and take it in to the corn crib.
I think that's a wrap.
So looking back through all those years, tell me what your favorite piece of equipment is.
Probably that John Deere tractor.
Very good, John. We appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.